Well, thanks very much for the nice introduction, and thank you all for being here Friday afternoon UK time, while it is nice and sunny outside. The talk or the conversation I would like to have with you is around COVID-19 and international business, looking at immediate impacts we've seen so far and which are forecast on international business, as well as then considering what interpretations could be how the COVID-19 crisis is further impacting international business into the future, what it means for multinationals as they organize their business activities, as well as businesses along the supply chain, and more broadly speaking, if you like, workers in supply chain activities. Now, that is obviously with a caveat to say, we don't know how long the crisis is going to last and how governments are responding to it, but I will try to build this in the points I'm going to make through this talk, and I'm looking forward to see how they resonate with you and how we can build on this future ideas and work. Now, to set the scene, I'm using data and predictions from a number of international organizations, first and foremost the IMF, which has so far predicted a significant economic downfall globally for all sorts of countries. Now, this is the latest prediction from April 2020, so from last month, and depending on how quickly economies are going to open their economies again, easing lockdown activities, these predictions may or may not hold true. There's also, of course, the potential of a relapse of COVID-19 and a second, third waves, and then these predictions will not necessarily hold. But considering these predictions as they are at the moment, they're already indicating that globally economies will suffer significantly because of the COVID-19 implications. They're also indicating that there will be a significant impact on international business activities. First and foremost, this is reflected through trade and investment. And within the trade environment, the World Trade Organization is predicting that there will be a slump of anything between 13 and 30% of trade over the next 12 months or so. Going forward, we'll see from the pessimistic scenario here that the WTO is also including and considering that potentially the COVID-19 crisis will last significantly longer because of a second, third wave coming in, but also potentially because of government restrictions that come into force in order to either protect local economies or through other means of engaging and changing the way global supply chains are organized today. This is a point I'm coming back to at the very end when I'm looking into some national level activities. The second element where we see a negative implication for international business is foreign direct investments. And here the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development is predicting that cross-border M&As may drop by up to 70% over the next year or so, and FDI in general may decline by 30–40%. Now, these two indications have direct implications on how businesses may organize themselves, as they're reflecting that businesses have to reconsider where their core interests are, where their core markets are they can serve. And in certain industries, certainly with an eye on survival, we have indications from sectors like the tourism industry that are suffering, and airline industries that are in particular suffering from the COVID-19 restrictions and lockdown implications. And the negative economic consequences this has on these industries will be reflected in them being less likely and able to internationalize and develop their markets further. It will also, and that's where I come into trying to interpret the data as it is and seeing from here what the further implications will be to international business. It will further also indicate, I think, a reconsiderations on how businesses are organizing themselves at the moment, and as a consequence, reconsidering how the global supply chain networks are organized, where they are organized, and how dependent they are. We have seen in particular in the area of pharmaceuticals that there seems to be an increased dependency on the Chinese economy and ingredients coming from the Chinese economy. But we've also seen in other industry sectors that because of the lockdown of particular economies, that we have knock-on effects on other economies and businesses up the value chain. And that's what I mean and indicate here with the 2 bullet points here of global dependencies and global supply networks. Where we have sectors that are very dependent on input, semi-finished products as inputs within the supply chain coming from other countries, coming from other regions, that may be more affected by COVID-19, and where we have supply chains that will otherwise be affected by restrictions in travel, restrictions in the way and the extent to which people can go back to work, and when they can go back to work, the extent to which manufacturing can work at full capacity. All of these have knock-on effects up the value chain. One consideration, therefore, for businesses that, if you like, orchestrating global supply chains and are the big multinational enterprises that we see as the broad names with whom we are interacting. One implication for these businesses will be to consider if they have to bring supply chains closer to home or reorganize them, duplicate them in certain cases so that they're less vulnerable to external shocks and increase generally resilience to their supply chains. That is a possibility, though it also comes with a cost, obviously. Once you're replicating and duplicating supply chains, once you're moving them closer to home to reduce one aspect of costs, i.e. the costs coming from COVID-19, you may increase other costs that are incurred by not having locations or products sourced from the most efficient and productive localities. And in certain industries will be more affected by these than others. And those that are less affected will be those sectors that are building and relying upon cluster agglomerations in certain countries where expertise and networks exist that make it significantly more efficient for them to source from those places. I'm thinking here of places like Bangladesh, for example, for textiles, southern India for textiles, electronics from South China. There are certain agglomeration effects that make it more or less necessary for businesses to source from these countries, or if you want to reorganize it, very costly to rebuild and set up new supply chains coming from elsewhere. A related question and problem arising from the COVID-19 is how businesses, multinational enterprises in particular, that have subsidiaries located globally, how they're working with international expatriation and the expertise and knowledge that resides within their management. These businesses are often dependent on having management teams and their families relocating into remote places in order to share intangible knowledge and organizational cultural aspects, in order to create organizational structures that are working efficient, where subsidiaries and headquarters are working in alignment and to the same objectives. Now, with international expatriations and the problems COVID-19 had in terms of pulling families apart, putting people in restrictions, there has to be a reconsideration, to the extent to which expatriation, to the level we have seen it so far, works within an environment where mobility is severely restricted. And aside from international mobility that being restricted, also mobility within countries, which is then affecting the extent to which expatriates may or may not want to move overseas with families. And interestingly, when we are seeming to engage soon into one smaller project, we were looking into interviewing expats in some places in China and seeing how they've experienced the whole COVID-19 situation and what impact it has had professionally as well as socially, family-wise on them, and what implications they draw from that. Related to that is the last point on this slide, knowledge creation and sharing. MNEs, multinational enterprises, are extremely competitive internationally because of the networks they have globally, their R&D centers and knowledge created, accumulated, which enables them to create very competitive products and services. Now, often these products and services are created through a combination of in-house outsourced activities across the core business and its supply chain and supply network. How this collaboration continues and how efficient this collaboration can be when activities are mainly happening through webinars, other web-based interactions, and are missing a social element and side to it, is to be investigated further. But so far, at least from the meeting I've had, and meetings I've had as well that are online based, they work. I'm not sure they're as efficient and as productive necessarily as face-to-face meetings and being able to communicate quickly by visiting somebody in the office next door. And again, similar to the earlier points here, what this means is basically an increase in cost on to the operations of businesses operating globally, and those costs will be reflected either in lower profitability of these businesses or in higher costs they have to charge clients and customers further down the line. Either way, there is then a negative further implication that comes down to clients and customers. Shifting slightly from multinational enterprises before I come back to them and their further implications, I also would like to highlight the implications that arrive from the impact COVID-19 has on global immigration. Global immigration is and the global remittances that derive from global migrants is a significant stream of funding and funds that goes back to low middle income economies, aside from product investment that goes into those countries, and aside from international trade. Predictions are at the moment that these global remittances may fall by anything by around 20% because migrant workers in developed economies and elsewhere will have lost jobs, will be on not a full remuneration, and therefore will not be able to repatriate the same amount of funds they used to channel back to their home countries. Now, that is one aspect through which we will see negative social implications in low middle income economies. The other channel through which we will see negative implications will be the lack of trade and investment just indicated. And this is, for example, highlighted in cases like the textile industry, which has cancelled or postponed contracts and orders worth billions of US dollars in places like Bangladesh. And this is a photo from one of those protests in Bangladesh from garment workers who are demanding pay, demanding jobs in order to be able to feed families, etc. What this means, not only for Bangladesh and textile workers there, is an increase in vulnerabilities globally for people that normally are living on very low incomes anyway, or that are living on multiple jobs a week. As I mentioned earlier, the potential challenges and cost increases for multinational enterprises through a reconsideration of supply chains, finding new suppliers, etc. What this could mean, if you like, quite covertly, is an opportunity for businesses to outsource productions into locations where people are more vulnerable and therefore may be more likely to take any job opportunities provided to them. This is work then that links to the stream of work Gary mentioned earlier I have in the areas of modern slavery, which happens to be in the area of textile as well, where especially migrant workers, international migrant workers, are very dependent on finding jobs one way or the other. And I think we will see an increase in numbers around modern slavery estimates because of the consequences of COVID-19. Now, how are governments and countries trying to respond to this? One aspect, I think there are three aspects that will have an impact on international business and how businesses organize themselves globally. One is the support, attempts to support ailing sectors in home economies, so beefing up protecting tourism activities, supporting manufacturers that haven't been able to export import for some time. Subsidies going to particular sectors may then lead to businesses being propped up, even though they may not be the most productive sectors, and there are questions to what extent this may lead then to unfair advantages and the competition between businesses that do not receive the same amount of subsidies in their home countries. Certain governments may attempt to secure supply chains by either incentivizing or forcing businesses to duplicate supply chains closer to home or at home, so that when similar pandemics may strike or other kind of similar crises may strike, the level of dependencies to other countries, which may or may not be seen as alien countries and economies, is lessened. And related to that last point is the point of attempting to apportion blame for COVID-19 to particular countries and trying to penalize those countries and economies. Now, and if and when that is strongly or stronger focusing on economies like the Chinese economy, we could expect, like we have seen with the US-China trade war previously, retaliations on the Chinese side, and an increase in hostilities, which will not bode well for the global economy per se, as well as for businesses that are operating in either country or across both countries. Summarizing some of the points I've tried to make and try to interpret how work going forward we might see, is that the current lockdown, because as a consequence of COVID-19 and subsequent global recession, we are in the process of witnessing now, will have implications for and through whole global supply chains, partially because businesses will have to reconsider if the current configuration of supply chains is a working and appropriate configuration, but also because businesses working through the supply chain have cancelled contracts and orders which have significant economic social implications for businesses and families further down supply chains. And those countries and economies that are receiving it have to reconsider what these dependencies and power bargaining relationships mean for them, to what extent there may be ways out of those unbalanced relationships. And finally, the questions around reorganization of supply chains for resilience, just as a point of nationalistic policies, but from a government, from a country's perspective, but from a firm's perspective as well, the question of how is there a way of achieving a very resilient supply chain, but at the same time not having significantly costs incurred through duplication and replication of supply chains. How this further will work out will very much depend on how each economy is responding further to the COVID-19, to lockdown measurements, to what extent local pressures pushing businesses or economies to open quicker, and then how normal business may resume, or what this new normality may look like. These are some initial thoughts on the impact of COVID-19 on international business. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing your views on this, as well as responding to any questions you have in relation to the thoughts I just shared with you.
Thank you so much. And I think that everybody who's been listening will see that, will acknowledge that we've had a comprehensive and balanced perspective on what is a terrible evolving situation. I would welcome everyone to put questions and ideas into the chat bar so we can start a discussion about this. I wanted to actually start with one question, which is basically to connect something you started with, Hinrich, and then that came at the end. At the beginning, you had a statistic to the effect that foreign direct investment is down 30 to 40%, and cross-border M&As is down maybe 50 to 70% in light of the coronavirus pandemic. Then we get to some discussion of areas in which trade and remittances are really being affected, and in a variety of ways. You talk about the collapse of the textile exporting from South Asia and so on. What about that? Are there particular countries where foreign direct investment is a really large share of overall investment, and does it relate at all? Does that link up with countries that are experiencing some of the worst falls in trade?
Mhm. I think they had two good questions with respect to other particular countries that will be affected. I think there are two aspects to it. On the one hand, there's a question how dependent are certain economies on foreign direct investments, on multinationals investing in places.
Yep.
And related to that, then the question how dependent are these economies to intermittent trade and export processing zones, etc.
Yeah.
The numbers I mentioned, the 30–40% drop in FDI, these are, and I have to make this very clear, these are predictions by UNCTAD. They're not yet realized drops in FDI, but they're predictions given how the economies work. And so some of these economies that will be affected will be the economies that are being hit hard by COVID-19. And we will then subsequently see further falls in trade activities from those economies. In a sense that the way I see and interpret the WTO data on trade predictions, this is based on predictions on current trade activities. That does not take into consideration foreign direct investment into economies and trade that follows from foreign direct investment. So if you like, therefore, the economies will be hit twice and stronger into the future through loss of FDI and subsequent loss of trade that may emerge from FDI.
I hear you. Thank you for that. I wanted to then turn to a question that's been asked by Bev, one of our participants. She asks about AI, artificial intelligence. A machine here is better than cheap labor overseas, she observes. And indeed, we've seen numbers of news reports about speculation that indeed some of these jobs may not come back. And indeed, could AI reflect or replace some of the jobs that have been associated with and involved in trade?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to see to what extent AI may replace jobs. I wouldn't think, and I don't think that AI is generally replacing jobs, because the way AI has been used in certain sectors, for example, like in medicine or law and elsewhere, it is often used to augment existing jobs, to make existing jobs more efficient or expand the range of services and work professionals can provide. And therefore, a view that AI per se is just there to replace jobs is I don't think, a valid starting point proposition. Possible, but not necessarily across all sectors work in that same way. Now, where I would potentially see a replacement, not just by AI, but robotics per se, automation per se, could be in places that are maybe labor intensive and relying on international migrant workers moving between places. One sector that may be affected therefore in this area could be agriculture. Within within Europe, we have a large amount of migrant workers or seasonal workers moving between countries for seasonal agricultural work, with physical distancing being in place, with restrictions to international travel. This might enhance and accelerate further automation of the agricultural sector in order to reduce dependencies on migrant workers coming in.
Yeah.
And this will depend on other sectors that might work very differently. And I think the question around AI, though, relates to Mohammed's question about reducing interdependencies with other countries, right? Because if a country were able to automate agriculture further to reduce dependencies on international workers coming in, this may in the short run work for those economies, and it may address certain concerns and challenge for that particular economy with respect to workers coming in. But having said that, at a larger scale, I don't think that COVID-19 should be used as a precursor of cutting trade links between economies, cutting or reducing what we see as a global distribution of specialized jobs and activities, because those organizations of global supply chains, of sourcing or locating activities in locations that are most productive, most efficient for doing those activities, has benefited globally people in developed economies as it created jobs, has helped creating middle classes in places like India and China. It has helped consumers and businesses in more advanced economies to have a constant supply of goods and services at reasonable prices as well. So the benefits of international trade, I think, are very clear, and that should not go amiss in light of COVID-19 and pushed aside in securing very short-term interests of national protectionism, which would have more long-term negative implications.
Yeah, we've got a question that actually talks from Roland. Roland's actually asked two questions. So I want to come back to the possibilities of trade lockdown and maybe China's involvement with the U.S. there. But let's turn first to Roland. Roland, I want to ask your first question. That is that he asks, should the collaborative approach to tackling the pandemic be transferred to trade? And then he goes on to ask, will this upend the current trade order? I'll make that the first question. There's something about the WTO that comes later. But what do you think about that? You know, have we seen, in a sense, a growth in collaborative trade and so on? And is that something that we might think of, especially looking forward to some of the challenges of both achieving the sustainable development goals and in taking on the challenge of climate change going forward?
Okay. So there's a broader question, tackling a number of aspects, as you just put extra elements in there, Gav, in terms of SDGs and climate change and further collaboration. I think just to address your point, Roland, firstly by saying that I do think that tackling the pandemic needs to be collaborative, and ideally it needs to be policies collaborative globally across all countries to achieve the best outcome in a very reasonable, quick time frame as well. And tackling the pandemic here means not only finding vaccines and solutions for addressing the pandemic, but also sharing information timely, having ideally a framework of how data to be collected in the same manner across countries and then shared, so that they actually have timely and comparable data across economies. And that's something that's currently gonna miss a bit. Difficult because countries will also protect national interests in doing so. But so I'm not sure that we're currently seeing a proper collaborative approach to tackling the pandemic as we could have or probably should see. And I'm emphasizing here the point of information sharing, data, and the way data is collected and being processed and being taken forward. And in doing so, I think we need to strengthen international organizations like the WHO and others, which then relates to your point, Gary, in terms of how to address SDGs, climate change, and other aspects. Because addressing those global socioeconomic objectives and goals cannot be feasibly achieved without global collaboration between organizations, international organizations, the business sector, governments that could collaboratively work and move towards the same direction. COVID-19 is seen by some as an opportunity to reconsider how we organize economies, how we could green economies and potentially green as well international trade and other aspects. Right? It could, having been in lockdown for, I think we've been locked down now for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and the accompanied shrinkage of retail sales. Does this lead, therefore, to consumers to reconsider the extent to which they have to consume and renew the wardrobes on a regular basis? Do we see long-lasting implications that actually indicate behavioral change that is long-lasting and therefore could have positive implications on the broader agendas of SDGs, green economies, and climate change?
Yeah,
I'm doubtful there, partially as well because we already see in certain economies vested interests being protected and industries that we potentially could reconsider their positioning and importance to economies. They are being supported by subsidies and other bailouts. It may be an opportunity, but I'm not sure we are grasping that opportunity to the extent that it would actually make a significant change.
yeah, that goes to the second part of Roland's question, which really then pertains to this question of the international organizations, and in particular the WTO. He mentions there the idea of the safeguard gateways as one element of the WTO. But I would ask a broader question initially, which would be: it seems that the WTO, as a vehicle for fair trade and for assuring that soft law can make a level playing field, this is really has been challenged well before the COVID has come along, and the safeguards gateway and the ability of countries to protect their industries has also been challenged. I mean, do you see, Henrik, as you look forward, are we going to see renewed interest, leaving aside some of the idiosyncrasies of some of the national leaders we have at this point? Do you see that can we hope for a renewal of interest in strengthening international organizations to assure a fair system globally?
I would hope that we see a strengthening of those organizations and systems. And I might have a biased view in a sense that I've worked for a certain short period for the UNIDO and had an insight and a collaboration working there. But I do see them as more independent arbiters between countries and economies and trying to bring together or mediate between strong national interests, especially between large economies that may want to protect their own economies, their own industries and workers. And through international organizations, there's a medium of sharing better practice. There's a way of trying to bring and align different national interests for the global better good and not just short-term national interests. The organizations may not be needing reforms in order to be working more efficiently and effectively, and also to safeguard them of accusations of being taken hostage by certain economies. But I think by and large, there's, especially for the UN family of organizations, I think there's a strong call for protecting and strengthening these organizations so that they can actually work in the broader interests and benefit of all economies.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I've been seeing, and one of my interests these days is also the international economy. And we've been seeing the previous global hegemon, the United States, stepping away from a thorough commitment to multilateral trade agreements and fairness. And it's been happening for a long time, and unfortunately, we're now at a very unresolved point. Just when, as this question really points to, we see the need for collaboration. It could be South-South if it's not North-South, and we could see new forms evolve, but there's still the glue of the overall global agreements that could be there. Now, speaking of South-South, the next question from Sidak is very provocative. Let me see if I've got it right. Sidak, we have Sidak asks, considering the UK as a developing nation, as a developed nation, which sector will be a priority of the states to revive swiftly and become stable? So, like looking at the UK within the configuration of, I guess, global trade and international business. Do you, and we, this is something, which sectors do you see being favored as it tries to reconstruct its position and its economic welfare post-COVID?
The UK is a very strong service-oriented economy. Advanced professional services, thinking of consulting, banking, legal activity, legal services are very important for the UK economy. And I would therefore, and then with that, the City of London being important for the UK, I would therefore think that could be an important sector to revive the advanced professional service sector, broadly speaking. The challenge there, of course, being that quite often these sectors or businesses in these sectors are organized in very large office spaces. With physical distancing in place still, the question is how these businesses can operate and the extent to which any office work and not being able to use systems and processes as efficiently as previously will reduce productivity of those sectors. As I indicated earlier, with the kind of challenges and frictions that arise from not being co-located, but having to organize everything through webinars and remote working and problems that derive from there. So I think if there were a focus in the UK on a particular sector, I think it would be ultimately the advanced professional service sector, and to the benefit of London as well. We hear significantly more currently from the airlines industries that are trying to get bailouts. We hear from businesses from the high street retailers that are suffering from sales dropping significantly. And they are important as well, and they will get their fair share of economic support from government. But it's ultimately a service economy, and I think that will be reflected as well when you take it forward. And especially then, as Gary made your point in terms of an IB perspective, the legal and financial services have a global reach and are interlocked into international activities as well, which makes them very important for kind of oiling the wheels of international business.
Yes, it's something. It's been notable that many of the workers who put themselves at risk in the NHS and so on have been born abroad or foreign nationals even, and that's been an important part of the frontline defense against the COVID. But we certainly in the service industry as well, we see lots of interpenetration with services delivered offshore, by UK nationals and with foreigners coming and participating in our businesses. And the City of London being proud to be the city that speaks your language. And so this, if there is a retreat broadly based from globalization, this is something that will play that could play some damage into our financial sector. So this is something that the distancing and the speed and immediacy and contact that's been part of the success of the City of London actually through its history, that you're right, this is very much at risk right now. I've got a question from Sophie now. And Sophie asks, do you think that the risks that are now associated with sourcing from abroad and the technical improvements that will make production cheaper, with all of this, will we see a significant move to reshoring, or do you think that there will be minimal impact and minimal reshoring? How do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I think that's a very important and valid question, and I think we will see certain governments pushing for reshoring of elements of the supply chain in order to for under the umbrella, if you like, of national interest and national security, trying to force businesses to reshore or to nearshore in order to secure supply chains and in access to goods. This is, though, in certain sectors already a movement we see anyways because of digital advances, that businesses are trying to reconsider on a regular basis to what extent a widely spread outsourcing or offshoring network is most cost efficient. And especially where we see labor costs increasing across developing countries, and especially kind of places like China, which is then questioning to what extent you could continue working in or producing those places.
Yeah.
But the reshoring is not just purely you're locating one manufacturing place from A to B. You could also have to consider the broader network within which that manufacturing place is integrated in. And often that makes it more difficult to reshore, because you have locally a large array of different related sectors and businesses present that help you to very quickly assemble new goods, for example, that help you to source quickly any product you may need, and if need be as well, quickly find somebody you could subcontract to when you have excess contracts and you can't fulfill it yourself. All of those local network externalities would fall apart if businesses were reshoring purely on the basis that something on its own could be produced cheaper, closer at home, but doesn't take into consideration the broader network, supply network that resides in the location as well, and what it means for the business when it's pulled out of that particular network. And therefore, I think it is a more complicated discussion that we will see on a industry by industry perspective, potentially even then firm by firm, case by case, and then how businesses can respond to this.
Yeah, we see that there's been a discussion for a little while on the idea of decoupling, and specifically if we can turn to China, the case of China, there's been this idea that we'll see the Chinese economy separating from China, East Asia, and even possibly through the Belt and Road Initiative over into South Asia, portions of South Asia, even as far as Greece and Turkey and so on. And we see this idea that there will be this decoupling of the global economies. And two thoughts about that. One is that so much of the trade in East Asia is inside East Asia. China's trade with its neighboring countries is so very strong, so that when we see, for example, you showed those figures that suggest that the impacts on developing Asia of the crisis will be significantly less than they might be elsewhere. That's one thing that we see, and then in addition, we see the idea that that there will be this at the same time this kind of possible trade war that Donald Trump was ramping up even yesterday, and suggesting that he'll cut off all connection to China. Not sure that's even possible. But how do these factors play out? Well, we've seen some damage already in U.S. Chinese trade. How does that affect the global system? And of course, paying some attention to the situation of the UK within the global system.
The US-China relationship has been fragile for some time. Before COVID-19 with the trade war, it's becoming more fragile again, as you just said. Trump mentioning yesterday he could potentially cut off all ties. And it's not, I would agree with you, he can't immediately cut off all ties with the Chinese economy because they're too interlinked and interwoven at different levels as well. But what it can lead to is businesses reconsidering twice if they would want to invest in China, or if they want to expand in the Chinese market, if they had other opportunities as well. And thereby slowly but slowly relocating businesses, activities. And this can then, in the medium term, lead to a complete reorganization of trade flows as well. And of course, it can lead as well to businesses, say Chinese businesses, relocating to places, to countries which are seen favorable by the US administration, and then under the umbrella of a new country's identity, continue trading with the US. So just to emphasize here, the reality of effectively and completely cutting off from China is difficult. Unless we would come back to the times where we have very severe and enforced sanctions by the US against China and everybody who works with the Chinese economy. And to what extent that is a feasible proposition is questionable, given as well the point you mentioned just previously in the comment with the Belt and Road Initiative and the investment China has built in other countries, and thereby to some extent dependencies China has built as well, and the network in Southeast Asia exists between suppliers and other businesses that cannot be easily broken up. The UK is, of course, in a very interesting position, given that we are also in the process of Brexit, that by what the government says so far still is happening and finalized by the end of the year. And the UK could therefore face challenges from two sides. On the one side is coping with COVID-19 and implications from that, as well as coping with the implications from Brexit, which by all means, from what we hear and read from the negotiations, doesn't seem to really going too well. And if then, in addition to facing COVID-19, we might face a very harsher than necessary Brexit condition by the end of the year, this will not go down well for the UK economies and businesses operating from here. And might touch back on your point about the businesses in the City of London reconsidering the locations where they're operating in. And if this were happening, then we would obviously see further negative implications for the UK economy at large.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I want to just highlight something that you said that came into your speech, and you mentioned it's part of your core research now to look at the social impacts. It is a fact already that remittances are in many countries the most important source of in the inflow of capital. And many countries now are the workers are being thrown out of work, or they can't get to their work. And so this is already part of it. We then have the serious decline in some parts of the global trade nexus. And we're going to see areas in which people who are especially vulnerable to COVID-19 because of the circumstances of where they live will in turn be especially vulnerable to the possibilities of the slowdown of their capacity to earn income, which is already fragile. And if in turn they are part of family chains, not value chains per se, but families in which one or more family members are abroad, supplementing family income to keep people at home alive with remittance flows, we could see a tremendous uneven social impact and devastation across the globe. I mean, you know, it's going to take a completely a new way of thinking about, um, you know, what it means to be human and what our obligations are to one another. At least I fear that. How do you see this?
Yeah, I agree with you. The implications and connections you just presented there, I think are very real threats for a large number of economies. Related to that as well is, and you touched upon the kind of vulnerabilities in terms of health as well. Very often we see those at the, broadly speaking, bottom of the pyramid and more vulnerable, lower income individuals. They might also not have the health support, health system, daily nutrition intake that actually may support them in any further COVID crisis and implications from there. When we then see that these individuals suffer twice, on the one hand, less funds coming from overseas, and domestically, they're also being constrained by job opportunities, or indeed in certain places that are migrated from. Both these aspects are constituting significant socioeconomic constraints on their personal development, on the opportunities to thrive and develop. And I've therefore seen calls that businesses should reconsider what their obligations are across the value chain.
Yeah.
Now, and if we just touch upon here the UK Modern Slavery Act briefly, the Act itself is asking businesses that operate in the UK to investigate and ensure that across the value chain there is no modern slavery. And if there is, to reduce and eradicate modern slavery. Now, the law itself has a number of problems and challenges itself. But that core proposition that businesses need to ensure that there's no modern slavery along the value chains, and the Australians have had a similar act brought into force last year, that to some extent gives responsibility to businesses to have a more social agenda across their operations. And of course, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights says similar things as well. And in connection with that, we have currently a broader discussion as well about the purpose of businesses. And I think that touches upon your point about what it means to be human, what it means to run business as well. What is the purpose of businesses? What is the purpose of business with respect to its global supply chain and any dependent and vulnerables across that whole value chain? For certain businesses, it may be an easier way of reconsidering who they are, what they're standing for, and how they operate with businesses. And I've spoken recently to one business that is working, for example, not with stakeholders per se, but they're looking more into who are the people who are vulnerable within the supply chains. It is a slightly different perspective to it, but it's broadening the field as well, because vulnerables are often those that do not have the voice or visibility, but are more affected negatively by business actions and their further implications. And I think we'll see more of that here in case of COVID-19 and how it works globally. I mentioned Bangladesh and textile industries, but we'll probably see the same thing in the UK and other developed economies as well.
Appreciate that. I think we're right at the 5 o'clock hour, and so I think it's probably time for us to put our hands together in our individual isolated locations and to give a big round of thanks to Professor Voss for spending this time with us and sharing these insights. We've gotten a comprehensive view of this aspect of a terrible and evolving situation. Stay tuned. We will continue to have international business. We'll continue to have trade and flows of goods and services across borders. And all of that will be done by people whose welfare we must concern ourselves with at our core. Thank you again for coming today and sharing this time with us. Thank you, Hinrich, for your wonderful presentation. And we look forward to seeing you all next week. So a round of applause. All of us are giving you, and thank you so much for the, as Lena says, food for thought.
Good. Well, thank